it's so important to believe in your own writing and to believe in your own book, to really believe in it, because sometimes the ego will arise and say, oh, it's not that good or whatever, right?
Or it's been said before, or there's so many
Yeah,
other books.
no, it hasn't. It has not.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm a champion for is that every single voice matters. Every voice matters, in my humble opinion. Okay.
I love that.
And not just celebrities. Okay. Because
Oh, yeah.
we live in a celebrity culture.
Hello and welcome to the Write the Book Inside You podcast. Tips, tools and interviews for coaches and healers like you who want to write a non-fiction book to boost your visibility, clients and cash flow while making a difference. I'm your host, Caryl Westmore, a multi-published author and energy psychology tapping book coach. Now let's jump into today's episode. Today, I'm really excited to speak to Nancy Swisher. She's the author of The Life That Woke Me Up Was My Own, a literary memoir that has a real message of empowerment for women, both as writers and in finding their own voice and standing up for themselves and stepping out into the world. Welcome, Nancy. One of the things that I'll lead off with is that you did win an award for poetry, and you are a painter, and you now work as a spiritual mentor and transformational coach. But we're recording this the day after Joe Biden's inauguration in America. And one of the synchronicities is that we were both very moved by Amanda Gorman's poem, the youth poet laureate. When she read her poem, The Hill We Climb, she begins by saying, when day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? After the rest of the poem, she ends with, for there is always light, if only we are brave enough to see it and brave enough to be it. So step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. And that is ideally where we want to be. But I think your memoir shows that maybe that's where we will arrive, but there could be a journey to finding that voice and stepping into the light. So will you tell us from your perspective how this relates to your work?
Thank you, Caryl. It's really nice to be with you. And yes, that was an amazing poem yesterday and a really amazing day, filled with light, actually. You know, I think it's Maya Angelou has this quote that we all love to celebrate the butterfly, but the work to become the butterfly is a big journey. And that's kind of what you're pointing to. And so, yeah, there's a journey to really finding and claiming the light, which is what I call your voice. And it's real important to have support for that, especially as women, because we have been silenced for quite a long time. And we still have all of that in our psyche, the fear of being seen and the fear of being visible and the fear of really speaking and sharing our deepest wisdom.
Correct. And many of our listeners for the Write the Book Inside You podcast are healers and therapists, EFT matrix reimprinting journey. They've done inner work that helps them understand that the inner child is often holding trauma. Although, as you say, it's in our society as well. But if we look back, there will be comments made by an older sibling or a teacher or a parent that stifle that light. And depending, I think, on the sensitivity, the more sensitive often the people who become therapists and writers who want to share how they overcame some of those voice hindering moments in their past. And of course, your book, that's why I really loved everything that you've written, because you not only wrote it in a very beautiful way. You know, obviously you have this MFA in creative nonfiction writing, and you are a poet and a painter, and you are a sensitive being. You know, how would you describe what you do in the world now, knowing what you know and the journey you've walked that you describe in your book?
Well, it's a journey, that's for sure. And what you just talked about in terms of the inner child, everyone I've ever worked with and everyone I know in my life has experienced some level of trauma. And by trauma, I mean an overwhelming experience that you cannot process as a child. And so then that in and of itself carries with it certain beliefs that we create during that experience in our early life. And those beliefs are limiting beliefs. And a lot of the sorts of practices you just mentioned are aimed at unraveling those beliefs and getting rid of the energy of those beliefs. Like a belief that I'm not good enough, for instance, or I'm not smart enough. So all those beliefs are a big part of unraveling those beliefs, and healing those beliefs are a big part of getting to the light within, because it's that covers up the light. It's a false self-concept. And our essence is always inside. Our essence is always there. So in the present moment, part of my work is helping people get so present right now, and to look at the power you have in the present moment to choose, the power to choose, what am I going to believe about myself right now? And
but Nancy, one of the ways that your book really shows doing that is connecting in nature. You have a very beautiful way of weaving in the eagles, even being with your dog in the park, but especially looking up at the eagles and asking, and they sometimes give you a message, write your book. When, we're going to get into that, the process of writing a book, and how if we get stuck, perhaps nature is one way. But can you let's get personal about your book. And I just wrote down some of the things that you believed and had to unravel over time in your own life. One is your big sister saying you're crazy when something came out of your mouth, which was really from your soul. The other was obviously the first trauma of losing your mother's death when you were 7. And the other was that you're a fake. You're again your sister. And I've found that in my own work over the years, it's often siblings saying something, I remember a lady, one of my clients, who her sister used to lock her in the toilet when her friends were there, be totally invisible until they all went. And she still had problems speaking up for herself as a result of that, being read your book twice and being very moved by it. The thing that stuck out for me, because I experienced that in talk therapy, was I think that chapter with the therapist. You said to her, I feel like there's something inside me that I'm not aware of. I never feel like I'm totally who I really am. She's the Wellfleet therapist. And she said something like, well, you're too creative to have anything like that. And so for 6 years, you took her interpretation of what part of you, a tender, a very gentle child part of you, was trying to express. So that's where we need that listening, supportive ear, because you also later mentioned, I'm skipping ahead, but Virginia Woolf had something similar with Freud. So there was a whole, perhaps masculine, or, before the 70s and 80s, and then the 90s opened us up to the inner child and the emotional brain, where we store unconsciously these words and these beliefs. So tell us, what was that caused you such shame and fear that if you did well? I think that was one, that if you stepped out into the world and did something well, it was like the other shoe's going to drop, or something bad will happen. Tell us about that.
Right, exactly. I just love how you describe all that. No, really, it's like, oh, right, she totally gets the book. I was sexually abused by my father when I was in the 6th grade, when he was helping me write an essay, which won the state essay contest. And the sexual abuse was fairly isolated, I think just one time. But anyway, I forgot about it totally. Because he was my only parent, and I needed to keep the good stuff about him in the forefront. Okay, I couldn't have processed the truth of that when I was 11 or 12, right? So what happened was, that was traumatic, but I forgot the trauma. I won the contest. I was successful. I got my picture in the paper. It was really, really cool, but it was linked with this trauma. So then, fast forward 20 years, I win this very prestigious award in New York State for my poetry. And I still had no memory of this trauma, the early trauma. Instead of getting my book out and celebrating that like most people would, and patting themselves on the back, I totally withdrew. Kind of became depressed, or, looking back on it, I might call it that. But of course, eventually, and yeah, the therapist said, you're much too creative to have ever experienced trauma. So I'm like, oh, okay. Because that's what we do, right? When you forget things, which everybody does on some level, especially if it's traumatic, you have to have what Alice Miller calls an enlightened witness to be there with you for the trauma. And so even if they're famous therapists, which this one was, fairly well known in her field, if they don't understand trauma, they can't be there for you. And if they haven't done their own deepest work, they can't be there for you either. And so that was the journey, and then eventually I connected with the memory. And so absolutely memory is important. Bring conscious awareness to it.
Yes. And we say in our work with matrix reimprinting, it's not only the memory, but it's the belief you formed. It's almost more important than the actual trauma. It's
absolutely. Yeah, the belief is the number one thing. And my belief was something bad will happen if I'm successful. It wasn't even a conscious belief yet.
No. Exactly.
But it was playing out.
And then on top of that, you'd had your sister say you're a fake because when you won your a competition, not the poetry, right. Your dad helped you, and of course that was linked with the trauma that you had already were bearing. And then one day in the car, you just happened to say, "No, we don't die. It's beautiful when we die." And then it was, "You're crazy," and then she said it again. So she was your older sister. So this really goes in when we're younger, what people say, the words. I love that you then worked through that. And I think you mentioned you call her Betsy. There was another therapist who was able to hold the space for you to express what might have happened. And yet, as you write in your book, your father's at his funeral, you also remembered all the beautiful things and all the wonderful times he gave you. And as is often the case, although we have to process and find the straw, as you say, to make the gold, once we've processed that straw, it does become the gold. Because in your case, and I so admire the work you do, and I've worked with you, you've become the facilitator for others whose voices might be silenced for whatever reason.
Eventually, you are able to see that everything unfolds perfectly. That's how I see it. I mean, I can see how it was all perfect because my purpose is to do what I'm doing. Now, I'm not saying we need to experience trauma in order to bring our light into the world, but on planet Earth, we're still at that point where there's a whole lot of trauma still going on.
Is there anything else you want to say about that? Well, just summarize again what you do. You find your voice, stand behind it, and change the world. That's your you call it your iteration of how you express your transformational mentorship and healing. Just tell us a bit about what you're enjoying, because you sometimes come to England and give workshops pre-pandemic, and in the future, I'm sure you will, from your base in where you are. But just tell us how now, in the times we're living in, you could bring together your women's club, or what's it called? To help people with this.
Yeah, it's called the Find Your Voice Women's Club. I'm very excited about it because it's a way for people to get the basics of the work and to be part of a community, and also to have time with me each month as a group where we go through the steps to finding one's voice.
So you have a signature system that you take people through.
Yeah, I mean it's not a step by step. I have 7 portals.
Okay.
And each portal has practices, and a lot of what I'm teaching has to do with the work of bringing ancient wisdom into the present. In other words, the work of the power of the subconscious mind is to look at the levels of our consciousness and how we get to choose what we believe about ourselves and about the world. It's just another lens or paradigm through which we can look at reality, okay? The inner child's an important paradigm for healing. But once that's done,
your actual writing the book, because a few times, even in writing your memoir, even this is after your journey is, as you say, you've transformed the child memories, you've reclaimed your inner child, and that she's not crazy, she's a brilliant, beautiful 11-year-old, or you can describe that. But when you were writing your book several times, and it comes up.
So there's two narrations in the book, really. There's the stories of what happened, beginning with my mother's death and ending with my dad's funeral, pretty much. Then there's the little sections in between the stories. And those little sections are very much about the writing process. I love those little sections. And I've had people say, I wish there was a whole book of just those little sections.
Well, can you share one with me? That
this book, I had to develop and transform my own consciousness in order to write this book. Okay. I wasn't going to write it from a victim place, because that's not what the world needs. And so this one's called Eagle Power. And I wrote this just before I wrote the chapter about the 6th grade essay contest, which was the hardest chapter to write. The eagles are back. They have been gone for the summer months because the heat in Iowa is too much. I've been anticipating their arrival for weeks. I love the eagles and want to be with them in the sky. I stare up at them with longing on days when my mind thinks thoughts of doubt, as if their power and beauty is something far away from me. But on days when my mind, body, and spirit are lined up, I fly with them. I hear their messages. Today, their message was trust your words. I can lose sight of the eagle power if I'm not disciplined in my thinking, for it is thought that creates. The 2 eagles that fly above me clearly inform me to move to another level in my power to create by taking charge of my thoughts, by not allowing programmed thinking to enter, not for 1 minute, 1 second. Can you imagine hearing this from an eagle? I am so happy to receive this message today, for today is the day I needed to receive it. I have not written for days, and a small bit of doubt had crept into my body, causing me to feel heavy like bread that refuses to rise. Doubt is quite ridiculous. I am happy to finally know this. But as with all things new, the excitement in the moment is momentary, and therefore lost if I try to hold on to the feeling. Thank you, Eagle.
Yeah, I love that. And, teaching people to write the book inside them, it can be a memoir, and often a teaching memoir, which has a message, or a, transformational nonfiction book. I have to tell them that it is a journey. It is a hero's journey, because you'll get the calling. And then I say, don't try and write the book, write it in bits if you have to. Don't try and write it chronologically. And then you will get what I call the goo, the messy middle, where you just don't think you're going to finish it, and so on through some challenges. And I think your book, as you say, it wasn't easy. And it's one, this is a question a lot of people ask: how can I not reveal things from my family? I'd like your answer on that. I mean, I usually say, well, first write it. That's your first draft. And then go back and decide how you're going to craft. I mean, Anne Lamott says, look, I think she's the one who says, if they did it to you, then just you've got every right to write about it. But what do you say? Do people ask you that question?
Yeah, I haven't been. Yeah, I've been asked that a few times. I think it's personal. I don't think there's a blanket answer for every person. Like, my father was 98 and a half when he died. It was perfect timing, because that was when I was ready to really finish the book. That's when I got the voice. So I would not have published my book if he was still alive. I just wouldn't have. Luckily, he was 98 and a half. So in writing school, they kind of said the same thing Anne Lamott said, let them write their own book if they have a different version of reality. I wasn't writing this book to point blame at anyone.
Oh, obviously.
I was writing the book to really show a transformational journey in a literary way. But no, my intention was never to blame.
That just reminds me of how journaling, to get back to perhaps there's a lot you can put in your journals that you won't necessarily put in your final book, but it helps you if you're going through a writing experience and you want to write a memoir, to maybe put, some of the things in your journal, crystal clear moments. And that's what I love about yours. You've got, specific. Natalie Goldberg says, don't talk about a tree or don't talk about a car, talk about a red car with, black upholstery, and always put in the detail. And that's, I think, a good writer, and your book demonstrates that, has got those details in. And so tell us how journaling in words, I think you were in your early 20s, in the 70s, how your first journal or maybe your journaling started to open up your voice, and whether you think it's still valid for people today.
Oh, my goodness. I think for me, language and nature been the most important tethers on the planet for me. And I grew up on 200 acres of really beautiful land. And so I had that from the beginning. And my father actually was very connected to nature. Mm. And then language opened up in, 71 or something. I wrote my first little thing in a journal. It took root over time. It wasn't like some spontaneous thing. My book ended up being around 32 or 33,000 words. But this just goes to what you were saying a minute ago about how we have to write a whole lot more than what it ends up being. Probably I had written about 400,000 words.
Really?
And then Michelangelo had a big piece of marble, and then it became the David, right? And with writers, language is our marble. That's the substance we're using. And so you have to keep just getting your language, I think, on paper. Like you said, it can be a journal, or I usually write on the computer when I'm doing what I call my real writing. It's just easier for me to do it that way. But it's like a journal. It's just
so. Do you have another book inside you? They say I usually don't reveal a title, but are you writing a second book?
I have a couple. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, we look forward to that. I'm sure people are asking you, when's your next book coming out?
Yeah.
If you could write on a sticky note or in some way connect, or you've probably done this, but tell the listeners what you would say. What would you say to your inner child, your younger self? If you could go back in time, what would you do to comfort or reassure her? What words would you say?
I would tell her that she's perfect and to not ever believe anything else.
Mm. And a quote for writers. I think you shared one with me previously. What's one of your favorite quotes about being a writer, or that would help people on their journey as writers?
Well, Virginia Woolf, as you know, is really important to me. And one of the things she says about writing is, when I'm writing, I feel like there's nothing more important than I could be doing other than writing. And I think when we are writing, that's how present we need to be. We need to feel like this is absolutely what I'm supposed to be doing right now. But the other quote is Barbara Kingsolver, which said, it says, close the door, write with no one looking over your shoulder. Don't try to figure out what other people want to hear from you. Figure out what you have to say. Because in our world today, there's so much about what someone else wants to hear from you. But again, don't do that when you're writing. Do that later.
If you're writing a transformational book, you do have to keep your audience, your reader in mind. It's how I've, as a journalist, one problem, one solution, take a person through some steps and help them come out feeling that they've got value from the book, and with stories. What I've learned from your memoir that's really beautiful, whichever kind of book you're writing, the storytelling is so important because you connect emotionally. So even if it is a book like I'm talking about, or if it's a memoir which has a message of some hope and healing, which is what I'd like to teach people to write.
I saw it as a work of art. But my next books are going to be more oriented towards the audience. or at least one of them will be.
But for writers who have a book inside them, which to me is a calling, they're writers who write because they think, well, it's going to help my business and I'm, going to do it for that reason. And then they're writers that I'd like to showcase on this podcast who really had something, a message to share, and they took the discipline, they took the time to put it into a book. It's so important not to edit while you're writing, but let's face it, and I think you mentioned at the back of your book, a good editor and proofreaders are so important at the end of the day, because sometimes we just can't see the pathway through the forest of words we've done. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, because I did the MFA and studied memoir, I had a good sense of the structure of the book. I had a wonderful friend who's also just a brilliant editor who I spent the weekend with. And there was one section at the beginning of the book, I knew it wasn't in the right order. I couldn't see the order. And she could see it. And we just went through it. It was the most magical weekend. And then I also had a proofreader editor, kind of a line editor who I use.
Because people will read the errors and you want to do it the best you can. So there's a bit more to it. Right.
Yeah.
There's a lovely saying I think you'll enjoy. She's a young adult writer. She says, I'm shoveling sand into the sandpit so that later I can make a sandcastle. And I rather like that when we're writing our first draft,
Exactly. Yeah, you should. It's a huge mistake, like you said, to edit when you're just writing.
Yeah. So again, it's interesting that you mentioned getting in someone who can maybe, because that happened to me with my book, first book, You Can Break Me Fast. I took it to someone. It was all these pages, and I always thought about it as like I've got all this information, but it's like the toothpaste I've got to put back in the tube. How am I going to make it a digestible tube of all my story and the EFT tapping and the case studies? And the same thing happened to me. She wasn't really a writer. She was actually a Jinshin Jiutsu, my therapist. But she obviously had a good mind for this. And she took all my papers. She could leave it with me over the weekend. And it was such a relief to have someone else kind of edit this toothpaste back into some shape that I could work with. So I just wanted to give people hope if it's to find a good editor and know that your book has the gold in it, but you might need to have someone help you.
And, I just want to say one more thing about one's book is it's so important to believe in your own writing and to believe in your own book, believe in it. And because that will carry you through. And of course, that's the opposite of doubting your book, but to really keep believing in it, because sometimes the ego will arise and say, oh, it's not that good or whatever, right?
Or it's been said before, or there's so many other books.
No, it hasn't. It has not. Yeah. And one of the things I'm a champion for is that every single voice matters. Every voice matters, in my humble opinion. Okay.
I love that.
And not just celebrities. Okay. Because we live in a celebrity culture. And sometimes people will keep looking at celebrities and they won't do the work to bring their own voice out.
I like you say that. It doesn't matter how famous or rich you become from your book. If you've done it for yourself and to express your voice, and then someone picks it up and says, your book changed my life or my perception. I mean, you must have had that. Can you give an example of someone, without telling us their name, where your books made a difference?
Yeah, a lot of my clients have told me that it helped them make sense of their own journey, even though, as it's not a self-help book per se, but it has a lot of wisdom in it. And I've had clients who ended up writing their own books because they weren't inspired poetry. They found their own voice. I
think you have a free gift that you want to offer the listeners, which I'll put in the show notes. What is that? Where can they find you?
It's a masterclass I did a while ago called The Power of Your Story. And I have a free MP3 download for them. And they can get it at nancyswisher.com/story MP3.
Okay, great. And I'll put that in the show notes and where to get your book. And just remind us again before you go of what the club you're forming to help people get through their invisibility and find their voice.
It's called the Find Your Voice Women's Club. I have a free group on Facebook that is a free group. It's not the club.
Well, that's a good place to start to find you, isn't it?
It is, or they could just go to my website and sign up for the newsletter. They'll find out about the club when they get the free gift.
Okay, so once again, thank you for sharing your book, The Life That Woke Me Up Was My Own. Nancy Swisher, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining me on today's podcast. Want a free gift to inspire you further on your book writing adventure? My free checklist, 5 book hook tips to kickstart your book writing journey, will help you get clarity on the key essentials to make your book a winner. Download it at writethebookinsideyou.com/free gift. The links are in the show notes. Until next time, a big virtual hug and keep writing.